This problem is still technically going on, but because of recent events, I think it'll be safe to share it here. To be brief, I had purchased a high chair for an upcoming baby shower. The family member already had a similar chair, and I decided to keep it for future births. A year or more passed before I was notified of a recall of that specific item. Several children had been injured by it. I took it to the store I purchased it from just as the site instructed, to get a refund. The young man at the counter greeted me with a kind smile, and I informed him of the situation. The encounter got very weird after that. I'm not sure if he was trying to be funny, but the way he said it sounded very vindictive. "We wouldn't want one of your little angels hanging himself, would we?" It wasn't just what he said. He had a creepy smile as he said it. I became livid and demanded to talk to his manager. She soon came out of a back room, and I explained exactly what had occurred. When confronted, he insisted it was just a joke. I'm unsure of what occurred after that. The manager relieved him and her, and I completed the return. I'd go on with my life, and things were normal for the next week. The young man had all but completely disappeared from my memory. The following weekend, I found myself shopping in the very same store. My son was riding in the basket seat just like he always did. I happened to run into an old friend from high school. I was very excited to see her. I briefly lost focus on my son. My back was turned for literally no more than a minute. The two of us were talking when she pointed behind me and asked if I knew the boy who was pushing my son up and down the aisle. This caused me to come unglued. I turned to see the very same young man pushing the cart holding my son back in my direction. As the cart approached, I screamed at the man to let go. My son, who had up until that moment been having a blast, saw my reaction and began crying. Much as before, the young man had a very casual reaction to the situation. He said something to the effect of, "Oh, calm down, lady. The kid's just having fun until you started freaking out. Now he's crying. It's no big deal. You should take a chill." A crowd had begun to assemble around us. Among the group was a store manager. He asked if he could help. I explained and demanded the police be called. We all returned to the office to discuss the incident. Somehow, he managed to convince me the cops weren't needed and assured me the young man was going to be terminated. It seemed like a just punishment. So, I agreed and left the store with no intention of ever returning. Now, we come to this past week. Since the terrifying interaction I had with the young man, I had been staying close to home. Briefly, I thought that he may try to get revenge on me for getting him fired, but a month had passed without any problems. Food was starting to run low. I made my way across town to another store I sometimes shopped at. This place was actually less expensive, but I disliked the quality of their products and avoided it. My shopping experience went off with no problems, and the cashier was very courteous. It was looking as if this place wasn't that bad after all. That was until I was loading my groceries into my van. Everything was put away, and I turned to return the cart to a nearby corral. As I looked up, my eyes locked with those of a young man, the very same I've been having so much trouble with recently. It was like he'd appeared out of thin air. He had a smirk on his face and seemed to get a kick out of scaring me. He quietly chuckled before speaking. "Your psycho behavior caused me to lose my job, but I wasn't fired like you wanted. I've been there so long, they just let me quit. And now I'm working here. I was hoping I'd gotten away from you, but it looks like you have some crazy vendetta against me, lady. If you know what's good for you, you won't come back here." When he finished, he turned and walked back toward the store. In a panic, I just jumped in my car and locked the doors. I looked back and forth between the mirrors, half expecting him to just magically appear next to me. The tears came next. They lasted several minutes until I was able to regain my composure and drive away. I knew now that I had to do something. I decided to stop in at the police station to see if I could get a restraining order. An officer heard my story and told me in not so many words that I had no grounds. No matter what I said, I was unable to convince him. Eventually, he came up with an idea. He promised to talk to the young man about his behavior. It was far from what I wanted, but I was going to have to accept it. A few days passed and the officer called to let me know that they had spoken, and it had gone well. The boy agreed to stay away from me, and I assured the officer that I would do the same, and I thanked him and ended the call. As I'm writing this, the date is November 8th, a Monday. It's been 6 days since I last spoke to the young man. With little other choice, I've returned to shopping at the first store I spoke of. There's been no sign of trouble. I'm hoping the officer's talk put a little bit of fear of God into him. He sounded very confident in his assessment. I'm sure the police would know better about these things than I do. Yet there's a nagging little voice in the back of my mind, and something tells me I haven't seen the last of him. This happened back in 2009, but after finding this sub, I felt compelled to share. My husband and I were 21, just moved into our first apartment, and I was about 6 months pregnant. The small one-bedroom apartment we found wasn't one of those nicer, corporately owned communities. It was more like a slumlord situation, but rent was cheap and we were just getting started in life. Now, a little backstory. The city we were in was still close to family, and my husband had a great aunt we knew lived nearby. She was one of those family members we would only see at big family reunions, so it wasn't like we had a close relationship. As a great aunt, she was one of like 13 children. You know, back in the day when everyone had 1,000 kids, and she had been married for many years with 4 of her own children. They were all mostly grown up, but being that this was over a decade ago, her youngest was maybe 16 or so at the time. We hardly ever saw him at reunions because he was one of those gang-banging kids that was always getting into trouble. Apart from his poor choices, he was born with a very striking facial deformity that really gave him a unique appearance. We'll call him E. So we had just moved in 2 weeks prior to this incident. I was only working part-time, so I came home early in the day and continued to unpack and organize until my husband got home in the evenings. Our then English bulldog was my faithful companion, and although they have a lazy stigma, she was a great guard dog. So it was early evening and there was still light out when I started hearing banging or prying of some sort coming from the back of the apartment where our bedroom was. On the other side of our bedroom, the back wall faced the parking lot, so we got a significant amount of noise when people came and went. At first, I figured it had to be a gardener or someone loading things from their car. As the noise continued, I realized it was right up against that wall. I peeked out our window, but due to the angle, I really couldn't see much. This noise obviously aggravated our dog, who wouldn't stop barfing. You dog owners know what I'm talking about. And it was starting to make me scared. Cheap rent came with some shady neighbors, and we quickly realized this wasn't going to be a long-term residence. So, this noise continued. My dog continued to barf, and I was getting freaked out because I couldn't see anything outside our window and I didn't have the guts to go investigate. I was really pregnant, and I don't like running even when not pregnant. Finally, my husband made it home just as it's getting dark, and at this point I hadn't heard the noise for nearly an hour. Of course, I tell him right away that I had been freaked out for the last few hours because of banging, prying, and moving going on outside. So yes, he went to investigate and came back saying nothing seemed out of place. Later that same night, we had made dinner, eaten, and my husband was shaving in the bathroom getting ready to take a shower before bed. Suddenly I hear him yell, "Hey!" in the deepest booming voice I had ever heard. I come quickly running to the living room and I see my husband in his boxers stretched from just outside the bathtub with both his hands on the small windows still inside the shower and tub. I ask him what happened, and he turns with an alarming look on his face and says, "Someone's cut the screen." I had chills go straight down my spine and was basically frozen. He yelled for them to get out of here, when some more movement started happening and he slammed the window shut and locked it. This is the uncomfortable part. As soon as he turned around again, out of breath, he says to me, "That was my cousin E." I was so shocked. I asked him if he was sure, and he says he could recognize that face anywhere. And then he started questioning what the odds were that E recognized him, and to this day we really didn't know. Immediately following the incident, we had the manager replace the screen and I placed a dowel in the window to keep it shut. We lasted 9 months in that complex and will never rent from a slumlord again. We have also not seen E since, even before the incident at a family reunion. About 2 years ago, we found out he had been incarcerated and isn't due to be released until 2022. We don't know what the charges were. The family keeps the situation hush-hush, but I truly hope we don't ever see him again.
This is probably going to turn out less of a story and more like a confession. Only my ex-missus and a few close mates know about what I'm about to tell you. Otherwise, you'd never guess it just from looking at me. You'd think I was some balding, church-going Middle Englander whose pulse had never risen about 70 beats per minute. But for about 6 months back in the mid-1980s, I led quite a different life from the one I have now. You see, I just married my then-girlfriend, and we were in the process of starting up a little family. And right when she was 3 months pregnant, Margaret Thatcher's Tory government decided to throw a spanner in the works. I lost my job. I was on the dole. I had a baby on the way, and it was looking like we were going to lose the house. I tried my best to find a job that would meet our expenses, but it was almost impossible. And as time went by, I got increasingly desperate and increasingly depressed, and I wasn't doing my job as the main breadwinner. Now, this is where Jip comes into the picture. Obviously, the Jip isn't the real guy's name, and I don't reckon he'd appreciate me gobbling off about our mutual history. So I'll just use his old nickname that I don't imagine he goes by anymore. Me and Jeb knew each other since secondary school, and although we weren't exactly best mates, we were still quite pally and lead on to each other if ever we were out and about. So one day, I'm on my way back from the door when I see Jeb outside one of the local pubs. I say hi. I have a whinge about the lines on the door, and turns out he was on his way into the pub, so he invites me in for a drink. I'm absolutely skinflint. At this point, I didn't have 2 pennies to rub together after putting food in the cupboards. But as much as I politely decline him, he insists on getting me a few pints. The clincher for me was him saying, "You look dead stressed, mate. I reckon you deserve a pint." Never a truer word was said. The first sip of the pint was like a wave of calm rusher over me. Not so much because of the ale, but because I realized it had been about 2 or 3 months since I'd actually sat down and drank a freshly pulled pint of lager. And let me tell you, I hadn't missed it. Then when it comes to paying, Jeb pulls out his proper wad of notes, all 20s as well, and immediately my mind is back on my money troubles. So obviously, this seeps into the conversation, and I end up telling him about the redundancy. At the door wasn't enough to get baby clothes, all my woes basically. Jeb then gets out this little wad of notes, looks me in the eye, and says, "How much do you need?" This is where I can hear a lot of you saying, "Why don't you just take the money? Are you mental?" You know what? You're right. I should have just swallowed my pride and taken his money, even if it made me feel pathetic. But that's just it, isn't it? Pride. People get weird when it comes to their egos, and for whatever reason, my ego just couldn't let me accept his charity. And even if loads of you don't get why I refused it, that doesn't really matter, because Jeb did. Jeb saw that pride in me and was true to his nature. He saw an opportunity. You see, Jeb came in to remind me of an old war film my dad used to watch whenever it was on the telly. It's about this American prisoner in a Japanese prisoner of war camp who basically ends up running the place because he smuggles in whatever contraband people want. He gives people what they want, and in turn, he uses that to manipulate them. This bloke ends up with the name King Rat. And let me tell you, Jeb was King Rat. So instead of just offering me money, he offered me a job. He said he'd pay me £300 to pick up a car for him. Only trouble was that he bought the car from a bloke in Bristol, So that meant getting the train down there so I could drive it back. For reference, 300 pounds was a lot of money for what he was asking me to do, which amounted to maybe half a day's work at the most. I knew that there was a catch, that the car might be in a bad neck or, God forbid, it might be stolen. But I really wasn't in the position to be turning down that kind of money, especially when he said that if I got the car back in one piece, there'd be more work in it for me. So that's how I started working with, or more accurately, for Jeb. I thought he was a used car dealer. I really was that innocent. But after a couple of runs, he let me in on a little secret. The cars weren't the object of value in those little transactions. It was what was in them. I had driven 4 different cars around various parts of the UK at that point, and not once did I realize that hollowed out compartments of the doors that had been stuffed with imported Moroccan hashish. What was I going to do? Kick off? Resign? I knew that there was a catch. I was just a bit annoyed that I hadn't been fully informed from the get-go. But then again, ignorance is bliss, isn't it? And Jib said that the very same ignorance was like a superpower. I'd passed police cars countless times, and I even stopped to ask for directions from one at one point. And at no point was I nervous, twitchy, or anything else that might have alerted them to exactly what I was transporting. And on top of that, I was 26 going on 40. I looked like a bloody PE teacher or something. You'd never suspect me. I'll admit that. After that, I got way too comfy making the journeys. My doll disguise must have gotten in my head a bit, because when Jim offered me what amounted to a promotion, I jumped at the chance. In these new jobs, my pay would be about 650 pounds around, just about double the pay. And some of the trips would be to the next city over from us, an hour's driving time tops. It was a no-brainer. Half the work for double the pay? The only question was what I'd be transporting. And I'll never forget what Jib responded with when I asked him what would be in the cars. "Do you really want to know?" he said. No, I really didn't. As long as it wasn't a dead body in the boot or something equally as sinister, I really didn't want to know. So I started making these runs to a city relatively close by to us 3 times a week, getting the train out there, picking up a car from these Turkish blokes, and then driving back home. And I was getting just shy of $2,000 a week for it. The wife was ecstatic. I was telling her the half-truth that I was selling used cars with an old mate from school, and she was far too chuffed to ask any probing questions, but others did. And I ended up losing a couple of workmates because they thought I was holding out on them, hoarding the wealth or something. But Jib had me swear not to say a thing to anyone, and if I tried to get them in the door, he'd probably have dropped me like a live grenade. For 3 months, I worked that job, and the whole time, the cash was just rolling in. There was only ever one close call when a traffic cop on a motorbike pulled me over for having a faulty brake light. When I brought it up with Jim, he assured me that every car would undergo a full mod before I ever touched it. After that, there were no problems. Actually, got quite pally with the Turkish blokes. I picked the cars up from 2. They ran a little restaurant/cafe type thing, and I used to pick the cars up from the delivery entrance around the back. The blokes will be sitting around this little table chain-smoking cigars and drinking this muddy-looking coffee. They'd say hello, shake my hand, and sometimes offer me a coffee or one of their little syrupy pastries. Sometimes I'd partake, but mostly not. Then I'd take the keys off them, get in the car, and bugger off back home. Every single time the restaurant would be buzzing, the shutters at the back would be open. It was a seamless transition of goods, very subtle. That is right in plain sight. There was never any fuss, never any danger. It was always the same routine. This is why when I turned up at the Turkish place one Friday night and the place was closed, my spider senses started to tingle. I go around the back to see the shutters down, but it's not like I could have just said, "Oh well, it's closed, I have to just get the train home." There was a lot of money at stake. It's not like it could have just gone back empty-handed, People have been killed for losing smaller amounts of drugs than that. It's just assumed you've stolen it. So I walk up to the shutters, and I can hear someone talking on the other side. Brilliant, I think. The meeting is still on. So I give the shutters a few knocks and wait for them to be open. As soon as I knock, the voices go quiet. And then, no one opens the shutters either. Again, my spidey senses are tingling, and I take it upon myself to announce who it is, just in case they think I'm the police or something. As soon as I do, I hear someone fiddling with the shutters. Then they start to slide open before stopping at about 2 feet. Again, very weird, and it's just silent on the other side. I call up hello quite softly using one of the Turkish bloke's names. All I hear is, "Come in," from the other side. So doing as I'm asked, I crouch down to crawl under the shutter. Then, just as I emerge on the other side, someone kicks me in the face so hard it makes my ears ring. All I can hear as I pick myself up is, "Get on your front, lay down on your front," before someone starts kneeling in the back of my back. It's the police. I remember thinking, you absolute chucklehead, you've gone and got yourself caught red-handed. I thought to myself, only when they didn't handcuff me. Instead, they'd started to dye my hands with something that I'd later learn was a kind of industrial-strength sticky tape. My bell had been well and truly rang, but even in my punch-drunk haze, it hit me that there was something wrong with the situation. And unless he was some undercover bloke forced to carry tape instead of handcuffs or whatever, I might be in a lot more trouble than I first anticipated. Once my wrists, mouth, and ankles are taped up, the bloke then drags me to a corner of the stockroom where I find he tied up and gagged the 4 Turkish blokes. Each of them had the absolute senses beaten out of them. My heart racing as I get to thinking that I'm about to get the same treatment. But instead, he seems to just ignore me and resumes some kind of speech he must have been giving the Turkish blokes. And that's when it slowly became clear who it was. It wasn't the police. It wasn't even some other gang or drug dealers with some axe to grind. It was a vigilante. I won't repeat exactly what he said. It was quite a long, drawn-out, and terrifying affair, and I think every third word would be the F word. And this is about to get obscene as it is. So I'll just sum it up. And what he said, what he kept referencing, was someone who died. I thought the Turks might have killed someone, and in a matter of speaking, I suppose they did. Because the bloke then LEDs on that it was his daughter that had died from heroin use, possibly having an overdose. But it could have been some other complication resulting from her addiction he never specified. Then at one point, he started ranting about how you sell it, but you don't use it. And I suddenly see that there are these big cling-filmed wrap packages on the table. The bloke must have arrived before they'd loaded the car up, and maybe even before the staff had arrived for the evening service. And all the evidence he needed that they'd sold heroin was right there for all to see. God knows how he found them. But he had. And for a long, it didn't look like any of us were going to get out of there alive. The first thing he did was start cutting open some of the packages while he was on his salad, but don't use it, rat. Then he starts trying to shovel it up some of the bloke's nose, working his way around, until he actually tried doing it to me too. I thought I'd had it, have some well-timed exhale and clean my nostrils out as he moved back onto the other blokes in a frenzy the whole time. I am just terrified. He's going to start using the knife in his hand, and that we're just seconds away from being slaughtered like sheep. But instead, he starts cutting the package wide open and dumping the contents all over us. He goes back for another and dumps the one on us, ranting and raving the whole time about how we're going to regret the day we're born. I just kept picturing the little girl I never get to see grow up. My ex-missus was less than a month from her due date, and the thought of her getting the news had been murdered was all I could think about. Not only that, but her finding out where I'd been getting the money from, that's what really got me the shame she'd feel. and the secret she'd have to keep from our daughter. I started to well up. I was so very, very out of my depth. I had given every bloody penny of that money back if I could just get back to my wife safely. And for the first time in my life, I actually prayed to God for literal salvation. Remember way back at the start when I said church going? This is why the whole time I'm praying, I've got my eyes sealed shut. I couldn't bear to watch the vigilante bloke stuck stabbing, knowing he'd probably work his way through all 4 Turkish blokes before finally turning his attentions to me. But in the end, I had to open them. I just couldn't stop myself. And when I did, I saw that God had answered my prayers. One of the Turkish blokes had somehow, God only knows, managed to work one of his hands out of the tape. To this day, the only way I can see him managing it is if he was cursed or blessed with being extremely sweaty. But either way, I just watched as a vigilante turns his back on us to fetch another package before the Turkish bloke just launches himself at him. I didn't really get a good look at what followed. Just looked like a lot of squirming arms and legs from where I was lying. Soundtracked by this man, a cacophony of grunts and Turkish swear words. But eventually, the vigilante fella goes limp, and the Turkish fella rolls off of him and crawls over to cut us free. About half an hour later, I'm sitting in a shuttered and empty Turkish restaurant, drinking this ultra-strong Turkish spirit and smoking my first ever cigarette. The Turk took my clothes off of me, I'm guessing to burn. So I sat there and was basically a waiter's uniform, smoking and drinking until the shakes were gone. In the meantime, now all kinds of different Turkish blokes turned up, presumably to deal with the vigilante's body and to clean everything down. By the time they let me back in the delivery room, it looked as good as new. Everything was clean and sparkly. The car had been wiped down. The fella had just completely disappeared. Finally, 3 hours after I arrived, I took the car keys and drove back home. When I arrived, I collected my wages and thanked him for the opportunity, but told him that that'd be my last delivery. When he asked why, I told them everything. And when I was done, he had to pick his jaw up off the floor. He ended up offering me a few £100 more on each run if I chose to carry on. But all I could think about was the moment I realized I might never see my kid grow up, and how no amount of money was worth risking that for. I ended up going back to the university during my daughter's first few years, and I'm happy to say that by the time she'd mastered potty training, I was working in this newfangled field of informational technology. A career choice that turned out to have a lot more longevity to it than I foolishly first anticipated. I retired this year, and I'm proud to say that I have a few quid tucked away, at least enough to make myself comfortable. I and the ex-missus are on good terms. I see my daughter and young son a fair bit too, so can't complain there either. I'd like to think I've earned my twilight years. And it might sound a bit up to me here, but I think I'll appreciate them more than most. Because I still remember a time in my life when things could have gone very differently, and in more ways than one. And then remember how that horrible cycle of greed, suffering, and death just carries on rolling, sight unseen, forever and ever.